You don't see the name Cargill on food packaging, but one thing is certain, every meal you eat is supplied by them. And now Cargill, the private company that silently controls America's food chain, has quietly shut down 3 factories in just 30 days, not due to fire, not due to lawsuits, but because they can no longer survive in an economy where everything can change with a single tweet. Even more striking, while Washington is still in meetings, Canada has quietly approached offering to lease those plants to produce food for Americans right on American soil. You might think their departure has nothing to do with you, but when Cargill pulls out, what you buy at Walmart, what your kids eat at school, and even your pension may no longer be controlled by Americans. And that's exactly why you can't miss this video. Cargill pulls out. Mass plant closures and the real reason. 3 Cargill plants just shut down, not due to fire, not due to bankruptcy, simply because they saw no reason to keep them open. Just like that, hundreds of people in Arkansas, Texas, and Minnesota woke up one morning to a notice. The plant will cease operations. No press conference, no major headlines, just a few lines in an email, and the entire town felt like someone had slammed the brakes in the middle of a highway. Cargill isn't the name you often see on packaging or in ads. They don't sell meat directly to you, but almost every dish on your table bears their trace. They transport grain, process cooking oil, control agricultural raw materials, and run an enormous backstage system no one really notices. It's no exaggeration to say that if the American food system were a stage, Cargill would be the lighting tech, the sound engineer, and the director, all in one. So when they quietly shut down 3 plants across 3 major states, no one could treat it as a minor event. These facilities specialized in processing turkey, a food once widely popular, especially during the holidays. But in recent years, people haven't been eating it as much, partly because of high prices, but also for a much simpler reason. People are getting poorer. They're switching to cheaper, longer-lasting items. Instant noodles, rice, eggs, things that fill the stomach without emptying the wallet. Add to that the constantly rising costs of inputs, from corn and soybeans to refrigerated transport, and Cargill's plants gradually became a burden. Running a massive meat processing line when demand is no longer strong, no one wants to burn cash to keep gears turning out of sync. But what stunned people wasn't just the closure of 3 plants, it was that it happened with Cargill, a company that's been around for nearly 160 years, having weathered the Great Depression, wars, financial crises, and even a pandemic. A company many believed would always be there. In Springdale, in Waco, or in the small towns where Cargill used to be the backbone of the community. Then suddenly, they weren't there anymore. And the irony is, some policy in faraway Washington may have accelerated this decision, even if it wasn't the direct cause. Over the past year, inflation has eaten away at people's wallets. Electricity, gas, food, all kept climbing. Some subsidies were cut. Retirees had to collect coupons to go grocery shopping. Middle-class families began counting every dollar while standing in front of the meat aisle. Amid all that, lawmakers debated something called the One Big Beautiful Bill, a new law the Senate passed in early July. People were skeptical about it, wondering if it would help them afford cheaper meat next week, or if all they'd see was less food, and grocery bills climbing by a few more dollars each week. Cargill may not have waited to see what OB-BAY would bring. They calculated early and pulled out, quietly, rationally, in typical corporate fashion. But for those left behind, workers, drivers, farmers, those delivering inputs and handling packaging, it didn't feel rational at all. To them, the plant wasn't just a workplace, it was part of daily life. Losing it, I felt like someone had unplugged an entire town. No loud noise, just darkness. And the consequences? Supermarkets have already started running low. Some reports show chicken prices rose 11 to 14% in just June. A few retail stores near the Springdale plant are closing early due to a sharp drop in customers. People are cutting spending or leaving. Schools have fewer students. Family doctors lose patients. And no one knows how many more companies will follow in Cargill's footsteps, or how many more problems lie ahead. We'll talk more about those in the next section. What makes it all more unsettling is the feeling that we're not in control. Decisions in Washington keep moving forward, while in small towns, where food is actually made, people can only wait and see what happens next. Cargill chose to withdraw in silence, but the American food logistics system is starting to make strange noises, like an overheated engine about to smoke. Maybe they'll find a way to adapt. Maybe someone else will take over those plants. But if a giant like Cargill has to flee from the land once considered America's agriculture capital, then it's telling us a much bigger story. A story not just about production or operations, but about control, about who's really behind the wheel of our food chain. And if that chain is starting to crack, each link coming loose, maybe it's worth asking, who pulled it too tight? But more deeply, Cargill is being struck back by the very system it helped build. Some decisions are made with full confidence, until they become the very thing that prevents you from taking another step. Cargill has never been the kind of company that loves the spotlight. They don't advertise loudly, don't make shocking statements, don't chase the stock market. They quietly operate, coordinating millions of tons of grain, meat, and oil each year. But don't be fooled. That silence doesn't mean passivity. For years, Cargill has been one of the most influential names in how American agriculture works, on the fields and in policy corridors. From industry associations to direct lobbying, they've always backed pro-business policies, tax breaks, free trade, global supply chain development. In recent years, according to FEC data, Cargill has also been among the corporations contributing to lawmakers supporting the One Big Beautiful Bill, OBB, a bill promoted as a tool to rebuild domestic manufacturing, restrict imports, and encourage self-sufficiency. On paper, everything looks promising, but while OBBA hasn't even become law, Cargill was the first to retreat. The closure of 3 plants, in Arkansas, Texas, and Minnesota, is a signal that something in the system is broken. These plants used to run efficiently in a familiar environment, cheap inputs, stable purchasing power, smoothly functioning global supply chains. But when those factors changed all at once, everything fell out of sync. Soybean, corn, and fuel prices spiked. Consumers cut spending due to inflation and benefit reductions. Supply chains broke down due to labor shortages and rising transport costs. Ironically, many of the things hurting Cargill are the same things they once helped promote. Corporate tax breaks, once seen as growth steroids, now burden the budget and force social spending cuts. When food stamps and living support are tightened, people are forced to choose instant noodles over turkey, simple meals over premium processed food, the very products Cargill's factories were built to mass produce. Global supply chains, once celebrated for cost efficiency, now prove most vulnerable to tariffs, transport instability, and local-first policies. Meanwhile, massive production models, once Cargill's strength, can't shrink fast enough to match falling demand. Large processing lines can't just scale down overnight, and when they don't run at full capacity, they lose money. So they chose to pull out. A systematic decision, cold, emotionless, without hesitation. But what astonishes many is, how could a corporation that survived the Great Depression, world wars, financial crises, even a pandemic, suddenly fold just because of declining demand and rising costs over a few quarters? The answer isn't in their operational ability, but in their structure. They're not bankrupt, but they can't adapt to the very structure they helped design. This isn't a collapse, it's a quiet backlash. Cargill is neither a victim nor a villain. They are simply the first and clearest example of how the corporate shapes policy model can turn around and limit its own creators. And they are not alone. Many other companies that follow the same path now face the same choice: radically restructure or exit before things get worse. But the difference lies in speed. While American companies need time to adapt, some Canadian firms, not bound by the same incentive systems or domestic policy shifts, are stepping into the gaps left behind. They're not loud, they're not competing, but they are entering the spaces Americans just vacated, not to rescue birthdays, but to operate in their own way, leaner, more efficient, and perhaps no longer tied to what American corporations once took pride in. That shift isn't dramatic enough to cause alarm, yet, but it's happening step by step in the shadows without noise. And while some American businesses are still grappling with the very system they helped create, a bigger question emerges. When the ones who designed the game have to leave it, what will happen to those still playing? Farmers, drivers, supermarkets, consumers, who have long depended on a rhythm now falling apart. Widespread consequences, consumers, supply chains, and food prices all fall together. Have you noticed lately? Some of the things you usually buy at Walmart, ground beef, eggs, milk, no longer have the same price, same type, or same place on the shelf. Sometimes you even ask yourself, I didn't buy more than usual, so why is the bill so heavy? It's not like you're unfamiliar with fluctuating prices, but this time, something feels different. It's no longer just general inflation. It's the feeling of losing control, bit by bit, in the everyday choices you once took for granted. And if you felt that way recently, you're not alone. After Cargill shut down 3 plants in Arkansas, Texas, and Minnesota, the poultry supply chain in several states began to break down. Over 1,100 workers lost their jobs, mostly longtime employees who lived nearby and were deeply tied to the local economy. Behind them were hundreds of chicken farmers and corn growers for feed. suddenly left with no buyers. But the rest of the story doesn't lie inside the factories. It lies in your shopping cart. You can clearly see it in familiar items: egg prices rising, organic milk disappearing, fewer options for frozen turkey, even though it's not yet the holidays. Ground beef, a staple for quick, affordable meals, has reached $6 per pound in some places. That's a 14% increase in just 1 year. Many may think the cause lies somewhere far away, like war, drought, or global shipping, but if you look closely, the problem is right here in America. When a major plant like Cargill shuts down, it's not just a loss of production. It disrupts the entire system: distribution, logistics, and even price stability. Walmart, the place where most Americans buy their groceries, has had to issue a public warning. Meat and produce prices will continue to rise because they can't hold prices if the domestic supply falls short. And to fill the gap, they've been forced to import from Canada and Brazil. That means still beef and chicken, but raised, slaughtered, and inspected under different standards. You won't notice it from the Made in USA label, but your receipt will tell the truth. With prices like these, your eating habits will start to change. Many already have, cutting back on fresh meat, switching to frozen, choosing white eggs instead of brown, buying low-fat milk instead of whole, not because of taste, but because your budget no longer allows old habits. And you may not notice, but your family doctor does. Some are starting to see older patients with low protein intake, rising carb and sugar consumption, because those are cheaper. The risk of diabetes, high blood pressure, and malnutrition is increasing. It's no coincidence that school cafeterias are adjusting menus, or that meals at nursing homes have less protein than before. When food prices rise, institutions have to tighten budgets, and those who can't cook for themselves are the first to feel the impact. Even the small grocery stores in your neighborhood are feeling it. Sales are down, and they've been forced to cut back hours. Some have even shut down their fresh food sections, unable to compete with big chains or keep enough stock. All of this began with a simple economic decision: close the plant. But the ripple effects are deeply personal, reaching your home, your kitchen, and the choices you can, or can no longer, make each weekend. And if you once believed, "At least I still have the power to choose," this time you may be starting to doubt that. An ordinary consumer, like you, like me, can't know all the causes behind each price hike. But the anxiety is real. When your receipt gets longer while your shopping bag gets lighter, when you have to choose between chicken and blood pressure meds, when you put back something you want for something you need just to make it through the week. A fractured psyche. Millions of Americans lose direction and faith. You don't have to go far to feel something is off. Just take a stroll through your usual supermarket. Items that used to be default choices, frozen turkey, whole milk, brown eggs, are now thinning out, replaced by imported alternatives. Sometimes you can't find what you like, only what you can temporarily accept. And you begin to ask yourself, what's going on here? In the past few months, at-home food prices have risen nearly 3%, according to a USDA report. Beef, ground meat, and poultry have jumped 8 to 14%. But for many older consumers, those numbers are just surface level. What they see more clearly is that every time they step away from the checkout, the bill gets thicker, even though the items in their cart look no different from last week. But more concerning than the price hikes is the feeling of shortage. A quiet but constant change, familiar items disappearing, dinner portions needing adjustment, and trusted supermarkets no longer behaving predictably. No warning letters, no apologies. Just one day, the thing you usually buy is gone, and you're forced to switch. That feeling of losing choice in your own meals is what truly unsettles people. The supply chain disruption after Cargill closed 3 major plants has left a gap that isn't easy to fill. Walmart, one of the country's largest retailers, confirmed it's increasing imports from Canada and Brazil to keep stock levels up. The Made in USA label may still be there, but the operations, processes, and standards all have changed. For many consumers, especially the older generation, this shift brings a disappointment they can't quite name. They used to believe in domestic value, in American food, American labor, and a system that made them feel secure. That faith didn't come from slogans, but from lived experience, working hard, paying taxes, buying local to keep jobs in their communities. They also believed that companies like Cargill, supposed supporters of pro-American economic policies, would stay and endure tough times together. But when Cargill pulled out, when plants shut down and imports increased, many began to reassess their own choices. Not to blame anyone, but to ask themselves, did I place my trust in the right place? In the last election, they voted for those who promised to keep plants open, to protect American food, not for politics, but for the belief that their choice would help strengthen the community. Now, looking at the empty shelves, they can't help but feel abandoned by the very system they tried to preserve. More and more older adults are cutting portion sizes, switching to frozen, less nutritious food to save money. Some are forced to choose between food and medicine. between organic milk and gas for the car. This isn't just an economic issue. This is about dignity, the ability to care for oneself and one's family without having to stress over every dollar. And when everything, from food bills to empty shelves, starts forming a spiral with no clear way out, people aren't just tired, they feel pushed out of the game. A game where only corporations and policies talk to each other, and consumers are simply informed after the fact. Prices may rise and fall, markets may shift, but what weighs heaviest on people's hearts is the feeling that they no longer hold the most basic right, to choose their own meal. And from there, their faith in the system's protection begins to shake. Perhaps the scariest thing isn't that chicken now costs more than beef, it's that no one explains why, and no one takes responsibility. When people once believed in something, once voted for something, and were met with cold silence, disappointment is no longer just a temporary reaction. It festers, then turns to helplessness, and in some moments, even regret. No one wants to believe they were wrong, but when everything starts slipping from your hands, maybe the real question is no longer, where did we go wrong, but rather, what did our neighbors do to stay afloat? Canada quietly stepped in and took what we missed. Canada didn't need to make a loud entrance. They didn't send out big messages, didn't make bold statements. They simply showed up, with turkeys, eggs, and tens of millions of pounds of food quietly crossing the border. While the US was still grappling with shuttered plants, Canada had already prepared everything, from packaging to logistics. And then, what you found in the supermarket, though still abundant, bore a new label, Product of Canada. The point isn't just the product, it's how Canada stepped into the gap left by Cargill. When plants in Springdale, Waco, and Minnesota ceased operations, Canada quickly moved in. Not to snatch opportunities, but to restore them. They proposed leasing the plants, retaining American workers, but running operations under their own standards, where output, cost, and distribution are tightly controlled in a system that has remained stable for decades. If you live in one of the areas where a plant closed, the feeling may be mixed. Your relieved jobs might return, yet you wonder, who am I working for now? The plant remains on American soil. The workers are still your neighbors, but everything from how things are produced to where they go is now decided by a system across the border. In Canada, this isn't considered a rescue, but it's part of a well-calculated expansion strategy. In June 2025, the Canadian Parliament passed Bill C-202 to strengthen domestic supply chains and support businesses in expanding production capacities, even on US soil. At the same time, Walmart Canada announced an additional 6.5 billion Canadian dollars investment to increase operational capacity near the border. A clear sign that they weren't waiting for a crisis, but were proactively preparing for it. Beyond taking over US facilities, Canada is quietly expanding its own production capacity at home. Poultry processing plants in Ontario and Quebec are being upgraded with new technology, expanding production lines, and gearing up for a sudden surge in demand from the south. Within Canada's food industry, this is seen as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to establish a leading role in North American food supply, not just as a backup, but as a leader. You can see that difference right in the familiar freezer aisle. Packs of food that once read "Made in USA" now increasingly bear Canadian labels. You still buy them, cook, and go about your life as usual. But somewhere a quiet yet persistent thought creeps in. Why do the most essential things now come from a place that once looked up to America? Not everyone is angry. But if you once believed in the power of domestic manufacturing, once felt proud choosing local products to keep jobs in your community, this might make you pause, not because the products are worse, but because the sense of control is slowly slipping away. No one blames Canada, they're simply doing their job well. But when a plant, once a symbol of faith in American labor and value chains, is brought back to life through foreign capital and standards, what you're feeling isn't just economic transition, it's a shift in roles. According to Gallup, only 57% of Americans now believe the government can ensure a safe food system. The lowest since 1999. That doesn't mean the food is unsafe, but that people feel disconnected. Every pack of meat, every carton of eggs labeled Canadian is a subtle reminder. We may be full, but we no longer know who we're trusting. And if you start asking, since when did America stop owning its own meals? That's not just a personal doubt, it's a sign that something deeper is shifting. No one needs to raise their voice. The question isn't what Canada did, it's why America let it happen, and let it happen so silently. Because if even the most essential things, like the food on our plates, nor interest year, are no longer in our hands, then what truly is? And if today is just the beginning, what lies ahead? Can we reclaim initiative, or will we continue losing link by link quietly until the system no longer bears our name? What future awaits a food-producing powerhouse? Change, revival, or continued loss of control? After Cargill's 3 U.S. plants closed in June, few expected the consequences to come so quickly. From Springdale, Arkansas to retail chains in New York, Boston, and Chicago, the shortages weren't filled by the federal government or other American firms, but by Canada. They stepped in by partially taking over operations in Springdale, retaining American workers but changing the operational model to their own standards. At the same time, northern plants received billions in new CAD investment, and logistics networks were expanded up to the border, ready to serve a market larger than their own population, the United States. If you were someone who believed the fields of Iowa and Nebraska could feed America, you might now be asking, do we still own our own meals? Because what's grown in American soil, raised by American hands, is now being packaged, inspected, and distributed by a system from Canada. Not just geographically, but in terms of standards. This is no longer about prices rising or falling. It's about the feeling of decision-making power slipping away. Because if even the food supply chain isn't run by Americans, what will be left? No one claims Canadian food is unsafe. In fact, they may do it well. But what troubles many is, why did America let this happen? And then, as usual, differing opinions begin to emerge. While some consumers worry that America is losing control on home turf, others, especially those in border states where Canada's supply chain has deeply penetrated, feel a sense of relief. To them, Canada's takeover isn't an occupation, but a reasonable compensation. Some even believe that if Canada handles food inspections and redefines factory standards, the quality might be higher, cleaner, with fewer chemicals. Products once considered low-grade, like frozen sausages or packaged chicken, if processed under Canadian standards, could qualify for export to Europe. Where American goods have long been met with skepticism. Many also point to Canada's policies. They have a long-standing supply management system, clear procedures, and notably, better worker benefits. So for some Springdale workers, staying on under the Canadian model isn't a bad thing. They see stability, clear health insurance, and a more tightly run operation. That sentiment, conflicted and fragmented, is spreading among older American consumers. On one hand, they once voted based on the belief that America should prioritize domestic products. They took pride in buying Made in USA, saw choosing American brands as a way to affirm identity. But on the other hand, facing rising prices, shortages, and plant closures, and then seeing Canadian food return steadily to shelves, they're forced to admit a hard truth. The old system isn't working as expected. Meanwhile, Canada continues calmly expanding its influence. They make no loud announcements, but data shows that food exports to the US rose over 12% in June alone. Walmart Canada invested another $6.5 billion Canadian dollars in the supply chain, building foundations just across the border. And if nothing changes, within a few years, most poultry, eggs, and dairy consumed in the US may be inspected, packaged, or controlled under a Canadian model. Even if farming still takes place on American land. This isn't an invasion, but it's a reminder, if you don't act, someone else will. When your domestic system can't flex enough to retain factories, lacks the policy supports for local supply chains, then naturally, that gap will be filled. Some states have started responding. Arkansas is exploring support mechanisms for small businesses to restart local supply chains. Others are proposing cooperative models where citizens, farmers, and local governments co-own small plants instead of leaving everything to big corporations. But these are still experimental. And as a consumer, you can't stay idle. You may not make policy, but you help decide who survives. Every product you choose, every brand you support, is a vote. If American food keeps bearing foreign labels, if production standards are defined externally, then one day we may wake up in a country where even our meals are decided by others. And by then, whether you support Canada or not, it'll be too late to reclaim that sense of ownership. The remaining question isn't who's right, who's wrong, but are we ready to reclaim decision-making from our own dinner table before it becomes an irreversible habit? Cargill is not the first company to withdraw, and certainly won't be the last. But the fact that a name once considered a backbone chose to quietly exit, yielding the stage to another country, has made many people, for the first time, ask themselves, if even our meals are no longer decided by Americans, then what is left? And that is also the final thought for you to reflect on. Should America reclaim control over its food supply, something that was once a source of national pride, or continue handing it over to another country simply because they do it better? This is not a question of protectionism or patriotism. It is a very practical question. If we cannot even cook our own meals, how can we run a strong nation? This video does not promote division in the United States or encourage secession. All content is presented with the intent to explore, analyze, and spark discussion based on current events, emotions, and social trends. We respect the Constitution of the United States and all federal regulations,